Hello, Mr. Beckman here, and I want to introduce you today to a routine that we'll be doing each time we meet. I'll try to create a video for this, and I'll expect you to watch it and do just a little bit of writing with it and a little bit of thinking with it, and it's called Docendo discibus. That might be kind of a strange phrase you've never heard before, and the reason is because it's very old and it comes from Latin, and it was said by a guy by the name of Seneca, who wrote a long, long time ago. And basically what it means is by teaching, we learn, or we learn by teaching. And if you think about that, that's a very powerful idea, that if you think about what you're learning in the mind of a teacher, what it forces you to do is ask yourself, okay, do I know this well enough to where I could actually teach it to somebody else? And there's actually studies that show that's one of the best ways of learning. So as we go through these sentences and talk about vocabulary and a little bit of grammar conventions each day, we won't spend a lot of time on it. But the idea is, if you really understand it, you should be able to explain what we're doing to somebody else. And it's always a good idea just to talk to somebody else about it. Or even if you can't do that, talk to the wall. You may seem kind of strange doing that, but you can always do that. So let's take a look at this. Notice we have a sentence here, and in this sentence I have highlighted in red two words. The word that's underlined is the vocab word that goes within the sentence. That's the word that we want to learn, and hopefully that's a word you don't know so that you can add it to your vocabulary. But if you do know it, you can confirm that by probably looking at the context within the sentence. And I think it's always good to understand words based on context. The other word that's in red is a word that's related, and I think it's a good idea when you're learning vocabulary to try to look at not just one word, but kind of a word that's in the family tree of the same word, and learn two, in a sense, killing two birds with one stone. So you can see these two words, cognitive, intuitive, have the same ending, but they also, if we know what they mean, and we will by the time we finish this, see how they are related ideas, yet even though they are distinctly different. And if we can understand the distinct difference and the meanings, we'll be in good shape. The other thing you'll notice here is that you might notice that something's wrong with these sentences. And the thing that we're going to be doing here is looking at syntax, the way sentences and words are put together to form sentences, and also conventions, spelling, grammar, punctuation, all those kinds of things. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but the idea, I believe, if we do this a little bit each day, we can kind of build our skills and basically become a kind of writers who don't have to worry about this kind of stuff and can get more at the ideas than the rules behind our writing. So take a look at the sentence. A child is not a computer. A third grader's cognitive abilities are partially dependent on his or her upbringing and happiness. So we'll come back and we'll look at the two words later on, but do you notice anything that is wrong? What I want you to do is on a separate piece of paper, write down number one and write this sentence down. And as you're writing it down, if you see errors, make changes, because the idea is when we finish writing the sentence, we should have a corrected version of it, the correct version. So a child is not a computer. A third grader's cognitive abilities. You probably noticed there that we need some kind of a stop here. This sounds like a complete sentence, doesn't it? Period. A child is the subject, is the verb, not a computer is the complement. This is a complete thought. And obviously we call that problem a run-on. Very common problem. One of the things that we want to work on when we write is making sure our writing is understandable to our audience. So avoiding run-ons is key. So obviously we would start a new sentence with a third graders, capitalizing that. A third grader's cognitive abilities are partially dependent on his or her upbringing and happiness. Sounds like abilities is plural. Are is correct for the verb. But there's a problem here, isn't there? Because something's possessive here. We're talking about the third grader's abilities. So we need an apostrophe to show possession. And again, we're talking about a third graders, so that's a singular possessive. So singular possession is shown by putting an apostrophe before the S. The only other time we really use apostrophes is for contractions. And in those cases, what we're doing is we're showing that letters have been taken out. But in this case, we're not doing a contraction like it is. We are simply showing possession, a third grader's cognitive abilities. Right, so now I think that sentence is correct. Everything else looks good. If you're not ever unclear about any of this, feel free to email me and ask me about it. But the next thing we need to do is look at the words here. So we get cognitive, we have intuitive. So if you think about cognitive abilities, that basically has to do with thinking. Cognitive is the kind of conscious thinking you do, especially when you're thinking and when you're learning, right? And we obviously think about those abilities we have that have to do with our mind. So write down this definition. I need to get out of this. There we go. So here's the adjective definition: relating to conscious intellectual activities such as thinking or reasoning. That's what cognitive has to do. That's the definition of cognitive anyway. And of course, part of speech is important because when you use these kinds of words, you want to know how are they used. Notice we're talking about cognitive abilities. So cognitive here modifies abilities. So clearly that would be an adjective, right? Now, intuitive also has to do with thinking, but it has to do with more of the unconscious kind of thinking that we do every day. Things we are, in a sense, thinking without thinking about. So intuitive, based on what one feels to be true without conscious reasoning. Instinctive. So I think a good example with this would be, for example, when you grew up as a child, no one really had to teach you to swallow your food, right? That's an intuitive activity based on obviously genetics and survival. So you were able to swallow your food. Eventually you were able to walk. That was pretty intuitive too. Your parents probably helped you a little bit, but you probably would have done it on your own because you basically have what you need to intuitively do that. You don't have to go to school to learn to walk. You do that before you get to school. Cognitive would be those things that you actually have to learn. So tying your shoes, not intuitive, is it? You have to spend a little bit of time learning how to do it, getting a technique. There's obviously many different ways of doing it, but all those methods require conscious thought. At this point, you could probably do it pretty automatic, but that's only because you've done it so many times. It's not intuitive. Another good example would be the difference between speaking and writing. You think about it. When you learned to speak, you did that pretty much intuitively. You were surrounded by people who spoke whatever first language you spoke. You picked up words. You didn't have to really even think about doing it. You have the software in your brain somewhere that helped you put that together to learn your first language. Writing, however, is a bit different, isn't it? You had to go to school to learn that. That's not something that comes intuitively. The alphabet is an invention made by humans, and obviously the alphabet that you learned, you had to take some time to do that. So hopefully that makes sense, the difference there. And hopefully you can see how by looking at both of those words and how they kind of go together, we get two words, but we also get two words that are good words to know. Another thing I like to highlight is just the Greek, in this case, the etymology of the word. Where does it come from? This comes from Greek. And of course, the Greeks thought a lot about thinking, philosophy. And in this case, that root in cognitive relates to knowledge or knowing. And you see that root in a number of different words. Recognize. If I recognize something, I know it, right? Ignorance is without knowledge. An agnostic is undecided about something, does not claim to have absolute knowledge about something. If I'm incognito, I'm hiding my identity. I'm, in a sense, hiding knowledge about myself. So see how those work as examples. Good idea to write that down, because in this sense now we can get a root in addition to getting a vocab word or a couple vocab words. So here's the sentence as we corrected it. Notice I used a semicolon here. We used a period when we did it. Either one is correct, right? In this case, if you know the rules, you know that a semicolon can be used in the place of a period, and especially when you have two sentences like this that are very closely related, because we're talking about a child and a third grader's cognitive abilities. Those are closely enough related sentences that a semicolon works. This is a question you don't need to write down, but it's kind of a sneak preview for next time. What does an adjective related to conscious thinking have in common with an adjective related to instinctive conscious thinking? Actually, that's not a question for next time. That is a question that was just a review of what we just looked at. So this is what we call retrieval practice. The idea is, okay, we just looked at these words without looking at your paper. what does it mean? What does the word mean that is related to conscious thinking? And what is the other word related to instinctive unconscious thinking? And hopefully you realize, okay, the first one, that's cognition. The other one, instinctive unconscious thought, would be intuitive. And again, 2 adjectives. Now, don't write this down, but this is a sneak preview for next time's Docendo Discibus number 2. What does an adjective meaning indifferent have in common with an adjective meaning the ability to understand and share the feelings of others? All right, so that's Docendo Discibus. The idea, again, is every time we meet, we review a little bit of rules, some vocabulary. These will build up. You'll continue writing these down on a piece of paper. And eventually, I'll want you to also create note cards for each vocab word. And the idea is to have on one side of the card the word, the other side the definition. And that way we can practice the words. So if I said instinctive unconscious thought, the definition there, you would be able to say, okay, that is intuitive. And you would be able to check yourself immediately to see if you got that right. So obviously a piece of paper to write down the daily Docendo. Eventually we'll turn those in. The other thing you need are definitely going to need some note cards and 1 word per note card, 1 word, 1 concept. So that's Docendo Discibus. We'll do that again each day. And again, I will post this so that you can see it and you can watch it more than once if you want to. Thank you. We'll see you.